My mama named me Clark Eldridge White. My diploma reached Dr. Clark Eldridge White. All my bandmates call me Deacon Bluz, and all the women call me Precious. Good afternoon, Chattanooga, and I'm here with my friend Barry Corder, and we're talking about the music history in Chattanooga and whatever else we want to talk about. I was born in 1949. By the mid 50s, because of the fathers and uncles and family I had, as a little kid, I was able to go up and down Big Nine and occasionally go around musicians who worked on Big Nine. And there are a number of these musicians we need to think about. I'll start with the most famous figure, who was our band director at Howard School. His name was Mr. James Kendricks. He was a master teacher and a master musician, and he produced hundreds of people and sent them into life with work values. Not necessarily artists, but he produced a number of artists. So any musician you name probably came through the band with Mr. James Prop Kendricks. He himself attended Tennessee State, and he was a master trumpet player. He had students who have gone on to become very influential in the music business. For example, Skylar Trauber, who now teaches part-time at the Berklee School of Music and who was a producer for Motown Records and worked for Columbia Records, was a student of Mr. Kendricks. The late George Edwards, who was the band director of Prairie View and who's buried on the campus of Prairie View College, was a student of Mr. James Kendricks. Mr. Kendricks also was influential in the musical development of Mr. Roland Carter, a very distinguished musician of early African American music. I could go on and on. But what makes Kendricks so important is he not only taught us about music, he taught us showmanship, he taught us the business of music, he taught us how to look, he taught us how to present ourselves, and he gave us a lot of discipline. In other words, the clock was very important to Mr. Kendricks. The other area of town I always think about when I'm asked about the musical history of Chattanooga is a place off of Rossville Boulevard called Park City. Who came from Park City? Watch this. The original impressions, including Mr. Brooks, the original impressions came from Park City. A group called Winky and the Cupids came from Park City, and a number of singers came from Park City. Winky is the famous Cortez Greer, a showman who grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and became famous after a plane flying from Atlanta to Miami was hijacked to Cuba. Mr. Winky Cortez Greer got up and entertained the people singing classical Broadway tunes and Motown and became a hit on the country club circuit. He died a very mysterious death in later years, but his name was Winky Cortez Greer. Now, another person that played music and gives Mr. Kendricks credit for his development is a world-famous actor named Samuel L. Jackson. Sam, where'd you learn about showmanship, Mr. Kendricks? Sam, where'd you learn about showing up for work on time, Mr. Kendricks? Sam, where'd you learn how to keep your clothes clean, Mr. Kendricks? Sam, how'd you learn to keep a posture in front of the camera, Mr. Kendricks? See, Doc Kendricks, Mr. Kendricks, man, he taught us so much. It wasn't even about music, but he molded us, and he was very hard. Very seldom did you see him laugh or smile. He was a taskmaster. He was like the legendary Captain Walter Dyett in Chicago, who produced a number of musicians like Ahmad Jamal and Roland Kirk. He was that kind of taskmaster. Each town, behind segregated walls, most black towns had a guy like that. And that's why the black marching bands and the black symphonic bands looked the way they did. You know, down at Florida A&M, where everybody wanted to go, there was Mr. Dr. Foster. And when I was in high school, there was a pipeline from Riverside High School to Florida A&M if you were good enough. If you got under Mr. Kendrick's tutelage, if you were good enough and passed the auditions, you went and played in the famous Marching 100s band. Well, George Edwards did that. He went to play at Florida A&M from Riverside and Archinard. Watch this now. Then he went to Michigan State and got a master's in music. Watch this. And he also wrote compositions that they still play for the Michigan State Marching Band. Got a job at Prairie View and became a legend at Prairie View. Won most of the Honda band competitions and had a wonderful band. He died because of an accident he had at a young age, but he was a musical genius. His name was George Edwards, and we loved him very much. We called him affectionately, we called him Stru. And when he died, he was the president. He was the director of the Prairie View A&M Marching 100 Band, and he's buried on the campus at Prairie View. Another person we need to look at is the funky drummer. His name was Clyde Stubblefield. And after talking to Clad Stubblefield, we developed a theory of Cold Sweat. This is what he told me. The rhythm that he plays on Cold Sweat, he learned that rhythm as a child sitting by the railroad tracks here in Chattanooga, imitating the clickety-clack the trains would make coming out of Alton Park, coming by Engel Stadium and going to Lincoln Park. So that clickety-clack, he started to imitate in his drum beats. He also told me, and I didn't realize, there was a pressing plant near Lincoln Park. And every day that plant had a press machine, and that machine would go. So he put that in Cold Sweat, so he got boom, 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 pop. That pop comes from Stanley Coocher Thatcher's furnace over there. So that was the scientific theory of Cold Sweat, the musical theory of how that developed. That's where the rhythm and the beat comes, and that's very much Chattanooga. Chattanooga also set the standard in terms of, listen to me now, the way men dressed, especially African American men, was heavily influenced by the dressing styles that came out of this southern urban metropolis called Chattanooga. And where did it come from? Look at how the Impressions dressed. They were always suit tied. They were the cool cats of the 50s. If you go back and look at the pictures of the Impressions during that period, they were always naturally dressed. They liked nice cars. Well, that had an influence all across the country on how cats dressed. I mean, there's still people here in Chattanooga who value a look. And Chattanooga had a look. You had a nice hat, nice shirt, nice overcoat if it was the wintertime. People dressed here. So the Impressions not only had an influence musically, they had an influence sartorially on black men's dressing style. There was another kid that people know little about. I mentioned his name a minute ago. When he was 16 years old, a kid named Skylar Trauber jumped on a bus and left Chattanooga. And he went on tour with a couple of bands. By the time he got out of high school, he went back to Memphis and he snuck in Stax Records. Skylar Trauber became the musical director for a group called the Temprees. He took that, and a few years later, he was working for Berry Gordy at Motown Records. When he left Berry Gordy, he went to work for Columbia Records. His name is Skylar Trauber. Skylar at Columbia Records was a line producer, and he went out and helped push the records of people like Herbie Hancock at that time, who was on the label at Columbia Records. I also need to talk about the culture behind segregated walls during the period of Jim Crow that produced all of these wonderful musicians. You have to understand there were a few dedicated music teachers like Miss Edmonia Simmons, who groomed and taught Roland Carter. Miss Simmons was the choir director at Howard High School. But under Miss Simmons' tutelage, she produced a number of people that went on to have outstanding musical and professional careers. See, at that time when we were growing up, I remember a time in my life in the Chattanooga public schools where I went to school 5 days a week and had music lessons 5 days a week for 2 hours. And then on Saturday, we went with Mr. James Kendricks and Dr. Adolphus Spence to Howard School. So from 9 to 12, we had additional music lessons. And any of these musicians you're talking about probably came through Howard School under Mr. James Kendricks or Miss Edmonia Simmons. Most of them, including Cortez Greer, had some kind of musical training in the Chattanooga public schools. Yes, the system was segregated, and yes, they usually gave us the hand-me-down instruments. I even remember an incident when I was in high school. They took us from Old City High School over to brand new Chattanooga High School to a so-called music workshop. They made us sit in the corner, and the man leading the workshop gave us his back. We sat there and we noticed that Chattanooga High School had not only tubas, they had sousaphones and barrel equipment. When we got back to Riverside, my bandmaster, Mr. Kendricks, was furious because of the way they had segregated us inside the room, and the guy giving us the lessons had turned his back to us. It didn't make us bitter, but it made us good. So that following spring, he put together a 16-piece swing band called the Rivieras. And I never forget, it was one of the first interracial competitions of bands. They took us down to Kirkman High School. We came out dressed in gold coats with music stands like Count Basie and Duke Ellington. We blew the roof off of that sucker. That was the spring of 1966. And we were the Rivieras, and we smoked Kirkman that night and won the competition. But we could never get past the C rating in Knoxville for the symphonic band, which was another example of Jim Crow. Because the first year we played a difficult symphony. The next year we went back and played a band composition called Sequoia, which was nothing but whole notes, half notes, and eighth notes. And we still didn't get a good rating, and we learned from our parents that it wasn't about you. We live in a land called the land of Jim Crow. So don't get mad, get smart. And that's what we were always taught. That's what I was always taught. Don't get mad. You know they're racist. Just get smart. You know, read the book. Sit down. That's what they told me as a little boy. My grandfather and my uncle, sit down, boy, and read. I had an uncle that worked for the Mountain City Club, and he used to bring me day-old Wall Street Journals, New York Times, the National Geographic, and Holiday Magazine. Now, this was a cook, but a smart man who probably could have been something else that won for segregation. Worked at the Mountain City Club, and he would grill me every Saturday and ask me questions about the things I read. So, you know, that was a quest to be an intellectual in the African American community, and I was a part of that. But music played a very important part of my life. I remember as a teenager starting to go down on 9th Street, and because everybody knew my father, I wasn't allowed to go in the clubs because I was too young. But what we would do is I would climb up, the carousel used to be right there where Champy's is now. And there was a big vent. And when they didn't have that vent turned on to ventilate, you could climb up on some boxes on Sunday and hear a band called the Cascades, or Joe Burke and the Inclines, or Big Joe Dossett and the Coachman. Damn, that's 3, man. I forgot about that. Playing inside of this club called the Cascades. And at one time, even when I was a kid, some of my peers like Skylar Traub and William Gale Peak and the Stubbs boys, hell, when we were in high school, now that I think about it, there were 4 or 5 places on Friday and Saturday night on ML King, 9th Street, that had bands. So you could go up and down 9th Street as a musician, sit in or play at 4 or 5 different venues. The music was popping in, and what I learned from my friends like Skylar Traub, musicians at that time were making more money than they make now. It was not unusual, even in the mid '60s, for a musician on a gig to make $100 or more. So if you played Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, you could go home with $300 or $400 a week. That's $1,600 a month, which was a lot of money back in them days. That's why entertainers and a lot of musicians lived pretty decent lives back in those days when they got decent salaries. That doesn't happen as much anymore. But no, the town has always had a rich musical culture. When I was a kid, there were a number of music teachers. Miss Alma Stovall taught a lot of us music. Miss Janie Holder taught a lot of music. I've already mentioned Miss Edmonia Simmons. She taught music. And let us not forget the classically trained but real hip Mr. Russell Good. I called him Uncle Russell. Now let me tell you Uncle Russell's story. Uncle Russell got religion maybe 30 years ago, but before he got religion, and when he finished Fisk, he went to New York. His mama sent him to school in New York to go to Juilliard and NYU. Well, people don't know this, but my Uncle Russell, and I loved him dearly, I call him that affectionately, Uncle Russell hung out with Marlene Dietrich, Marlon Brando, Sinatra, all the big stars. He would never tell you the stories because, you know, after he joined the church, he got real religious. He played for Mahalia Jackson because I used to goad him. I say, Uncle Russell, tell me a story about Mahalia Jackson, because, you know, she was from New Orleans. I bet she sang the blues and drank some liquor, didn't she? And he wasn't saying anything. He just looked at me and laughed. I said, tell me about the parties y'all had, Uncle Russell. So he told me about Marlene Dietrich because she was one of my favorite actresses. But he wouldn't tell me much. And then he jumped back. But, man, this guy could play. Russell Good could play with the best of them. Russell Good could play like Oscar Peterson. But he chose in his later life to play classical music. So those were the kinds of people at the musical culture, not to mention the genius Roland Carter. we saw Roland Carr develop as a kid in junior high school. By the time he got to high school, he was a music master. Roland Carter was in the marching band at Howard. He was in the Glee Club. He went on to have a distinguished career as a professor at Hampton University, came back to UTC, and he also started studying the black folk tradition. Roland Carter thinks the black folk tradition and the black spirituals are very much an important part of the black musical tradition. And as I delve into black folklore for my own research as a blues musician, it's very important. So that's one of the very important and still influential people in the world, actually. They're still going to conferences, still giving lectures. His name is Mr. Roland Carter, Professor Emeritus at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga Music Department. We also have to bring into this conversation a man by the name of T. Bumpus. T. Bumpus went to Howard School, and Howard School historically was known for producing a number of jazz players and who played brass instruments, like attorney Jody Blackshear and a guy named Gustus. Well, T. Bumpus also came out of one of those bands at Howard School under Mr. Kendricks and Mr. Hamilton. And T. Bumpus went on to become a line producer at Motown Records. So the quality of musicians that was produced here, T. Bumpus is another example of a person who came from the Mr. Kendricks tutelage and went on to do great things, and he's still doing great things in the music business. Right now he has a non-profit organization that's teaching children around the city jazz music. Another guy I know that should be mentioned is Willie Kitchens, an impeccably dressed, superbly trained singer who's worked with people like the Impressions and done his own work. Willie Kitchens is an example of a contemporary vocalist and instrumentalist who has above average talent and has made a tremendous impact on the musical community in Chattanooga. I hope these historical sketches of famous musicians and famous musical people has been helpful. I hope that somehow it enlightens you and makes your soul happy. On behalf of Blues Chattanooga, my nonprofit organization, I am Deacon Bluz. With everybody in the sound of my voice, say love. From the house of pain to the house of love. Until I see you next time down the Blues Highway, you stay up and let nature have fun with you. Peace out, y'all.